how do we measure, so this is another one, I'm going to give you 10 seconds just to think about this, and then I'll let you talk about it. How do we measure whether a student is growing quickly enough? So it's a slightly different question. There's a little different interpretation in the way that question is asked. How do we measure whether a student is growing quickly enough? Like 5 more seconds just to think. All right, talk in your groups. What does it mean to grow quickly enough?
The growth indicator number 2 indicates, but I don't know what that is.
So is it measuring by percentile, like comparing the percentile from last year to this year?
It looks like they've grown a whole level. So when I look at, I don't really know these charts, but number 2 indicator.
Right.
So the first student has gone from a 1 to a 2.
Or is it buckets, like this?
Yeah, I don't know.
Something with the buckets?
That's what I was trying to.
Okay.
So if you got both, so like student 1 up there, or so the first student has check marks all the way across, and they grew 2 buckets really at this point. If you're looking at the second one, they've gone through 1, 2, 3, 4 buckets.
Maybe let's just say
The third student,
Doesn't have that check.
yeah, they actually went up for PM1 and then back down for PM2. And then
Does the third student satisfy what the first 2 students did in terms of the
by
criteria that you're talking about?
PM2,
By PM2. Okay,
No.
gotcha. Okay.
because they went up for PM1 but then went back down for PM2. Yeah. So then if you look at the 4th and the 5th student, they stayed in the same bucket. They didn't get 2 check marks on indicator 2.
Look at 7.
Number
Student
7, is
7.
that what you said?
Yeah.
Is that student
Do they
G?
have a student G.
So they went down, but then by PM2 went all the way back up a bucket. So technically
One
for
bucket.
PM1,
So it fit the criteria? Okay.
We have steps that we require, but I don't know that this chart helps us.
What do you notice about the rows of students who have a check mark for numerator 2? What do they have in common?
Numerator
Or like maybe a couple of students that quickly enough need
None of mine have it red.
I was gonna say the green.
That's one thing they have in common. What else? What about that
80,
green line?
maybe let's just say 89.
Is it if they've moved a bucket?
They've moved from.
The length of that line
So like if
puts
I'm
them
like,
across one of those thresholds.
Okay, based. Okay.
They went
okay.
from 1 to 2.
Right, not the right. Again, we're not looking at the levels. We're looking at the. Okay.
Yeah, the
So
vertical.
they're right. They've crossed the. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah,
Okay.
just kind of
okay.
like learning games.
Okay.
You know, where
Right.
you have to go from a mid to a high or a high to a low level type. Yeah.
So we can use.
So we
based
talked
on-
about growth indicator number 2 being your buckets yesterday.
Right.
And then
Right.
your level 4s and 5s are maintaining. Perfect. And your levels 1 to 2, 3 are having to move.
Right.
all right. Is anyone willing to share? What does it mean to grow quickly enough? What does it mean to grow quickly
we
enough?
think that, like when we compared all the students with the indicators checked, each one of those students grew at least a bucket. So when you're looking across the
Which indicator?
achievement levels for indicator 2,
Oh, so you were looking at growth indicator 2.
right? If
Okay.
they're growing quickly enough. So those students, if you look at the first 2 students from PM1 to PM2, they have a growth of a bucket. But then if you look at the third student, they actually decreased or went down in their
Okay.
achievement levels. But all of the ones with the indicators checked off for indicator 2
Gotcha.
grew a bucket.
And I noticed on student D, they have that check for indicator 1. So they're learning in years material and in years time. Why doesn't student D have that check for indicator 2? Yeah, they didn't grow that bucket, right? And so, Emily, I like that you pointed out this question is represented, it's sort of quantified in growth indicator number 2. So growth indicator number 2 is that growing quickly enough. Why does that growing a bucket matter? Like, why do we need more than just maintaining that percentile ranking? Why do we need more than that sometimes?
Close the gaps.
Close gaps for...
Kids behind.
Yeah, for kids behind, right? Like a student who's, in that like low 1, like 5th percentile, if they just stay 5th percentile, are they ever going to reach proficiency? Right? On the other end of the spectrum, a student that's like 93rd percentile, if they just stay 93rd percentile, chances are they're okay. Like maintaining that 93rd percentile is a very different thing than maintaining a 5th percentile. So those lower percentiles, students that aren't necessarily proficient yet, if they don't grow more than the students who are performing at the higher end of the percentiles, they're never going to catch up. And so just a quick reminder on that. Level 1, 2, and 3 needs to move up a bucket. So I like to think of this as like it's actually a little more rigorous than the way the state calculates gains. 3s don't have to become 4s to meet learning gains with the state. Here, we're looking at 3s need to move up that bucket as well. When you look at how the state defines levels, 3 is defined as like ready for the next grade level, but they're going to need support. Right? It's not until level 4 where we confidently feel that students are ready for the next grade level. Like they have reached the appropriate depth and rigor of their current grade level standards in order to be successful on their own in that next grade level. So even level 3s, in order to be growing quickly enough, we want to see that movement into 4. So level 3s, we want to also move into 4. 4s and 5s, maintain or increase, right? So maintaining is enough if maintaining also maintains the level. There are some cases where like if I stay 87th percentile, maybe I was a 5 last year, 87th percentile again would be a 4. So there are some places where it moves. So some students might, at the higher end, might actually have to grow enough in order to maintain their level. So a 5 goes to a 4, that's not quickly enough. A 4 goes to a 3, that's not quickly enough. We have to maintain or grow enough to stay in that. So that's growth indicator 2. So that's why I say like growth indicator 1 is kind of the minimum, right? At minimum, we want to maintain that percentile, but some students need to be growing more than other students. Needs of all students aren't the same, and so that's what growth indicator 2 is for. Growth indicator 2 helps us make sure that our diversely scoring students are all getting what they need, if that makes sense. So that's growth indicator 1, growth indicator 2. Can someone meet growth indicator 2? Now I'll just let you can just answer this out. You don't have to talk about this one. Could someone meet growth indicator 2 without meeting growth indicator 1? What do you think? I see some head nods going this way. Confident enough to say no out loud or no, right? Let's just, I mean, this is anecdotal. This is just one data set here, but do you see any checks for 2 where there's not a check for 1? Right? Yeah, in 1, you've got to maintain or increase your percentile. And so if I am increasing my percentile enough to grow a bucket, well, then I increased my percentile. So that's also growth indicator 1. If I maintained or increased my percentile enough to stay a 4 or a 5, well, then I maintained my percentile. That's also growth indicator 1. So you'll never see like checks for 2 where there's not checks for 1. It's also helpful to remember, like when you look at these percentages, this 17% is a subset of that 38%. So like we wouldn't like add them together and say, hey, I have, 50 whatever, 60 whatever percent of my students are meeting this, because that 17% is part of that 38%. That 17% is just meeting the more rigorous demand that we're looking for, making sure everyone's on pace.